Everyone, it is 9:30 and so I resume the hearings. I'm not going to do a big, long, formal opening. It's rather too warm for that. But I think if I can ask Carol firstly to do the housekeeping announcement, I'd be grateful.
Good morning. There's no scheduled fire alarm test during the planning inquiry, so if a fire alarm sounds, please wake your way to the nearest exit and gather on the corner of Claremont Terrace, which is outside the J&B building, just to the left down there. Do not stop to retrieve any belongings, but exit the building as quickly and safely as possible following the green exit routes. Do not enter the building until a fire marshal or member of the fire service tells you it's safe to do so. Door security, please only use the main doors which are here to access and exit the building. For security purposes, do not use the side doors unless you are a wheelchair user and someone is available to unlock and relock the door after you. Do not let anyone into the building who you do not know. York City Church or Citadel staff are generally available to ask if you're unsure. There are other people using the building at the same time as there are language classes going on while we're having the inquiry. The toilets are situated on the ground floor, just down that side corridor there. Water, there's drinking water available. Particularly with the warm weather, if anybody needs any more water or anything, if you just let me know. There's also some more water out on the foyer for people from the public gallery or if you run out in here. Other refreshments are available on Gilligate, and there's a Sainsbury's Express and Bootham. You'll also notice that the proceedings are being filmed. If you have an issue with being filmed at all, if you let me know and I can sort something out about where you sat and move you. The details of the Wi-Fi, it's Citadel Guest. The password is General Booth 1883 and the informations are written down either side of the room so you can get them from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Carol. I think we do have some people new to the hearings today, so I think it's worth us very quickly doing brief introductions. If I could ask Mr. Elvin, first of all, on the council side, and if we just go around the table, please.
David Elvin, QC, leading for York City Council, and with me, Matthew Henderson, who will be leading on today's matter.
Morning everyone, Laura Bartle with the York City Council.
Morning, Kat Crisp, Barton Moore now Stantec.
Good morning, Catherine Jukes, Directions Planning.
Good morning, Councillor Andrew Dykes, Dunnington Parish Council.
Dave Merritt, representing York Labour Party.
Councillor Matt Waters, Osborwick and Derwent Ward.
Mark Lane from DPP, representing Mulgrave Developments Limited.
I'm Chris Wedgwood, just represent myself, thank you.
Councillor John Gallery, representing Elvington Parish Council.
Simon Willis, I was a long-time resident of Elvington and own a property there.
Joanne Kinder, Elvington resident.
Tim Tozer, Elvington resident.
Thank you very much, everyone. Good morning and welcome. Right, so today then is Matter 8, that is the Non-Strategic Housing Allocations Day. So just to bring people up to speed, people will be aware that the Council, ahead of these Phase 3 hearings, put forward some main modifications, a schedule of main modifications, some of which relate to today's topic. However, this morning the Council has also tabled some additional, some further proposed main modifications, and I think it might just help if the Council could first of all just sort of briefly take us through those and explain the reason for them.
So yes, of course. You have on the table before you the composite version of Policy H1. So what we've tried to do here is to reflect all of the changes in a single, hopefully easy to use document for today's purposes. The changes, whilst there are a number of them, are all individually minor. They are on the whole clarifications or updates, particularly to the table. I'll take you through the main points now. I'm going to actually start at the back of the table. So at the bottom of the table, you will see a series of additional cross-references to the GI policies and to a number of the DM policies, and that is in response to your first two questions that we'll come on to today. So essentially, because the Council's position that the development management policies and the other policies within the plan are sufficient, it's not necessary to have site-specific policies for these small site allocations, but nevertheless, for the purposes of clarity, we've included those cross-references there. So that's the first point. Turning then back to the first page and the text of the policy itself, we've adopted essentially a similar approach of clarification here. There are a number of parts of this policy that were either superfluous or were simply duplicating what was elsewhere. So we have clarified and simplified that. Essentially, the first paragraph with the minor changes there makes clear that these are primarily residential allocations. What we've then done is remove the additional text that we didn't consider as necessary, but we've inserted 3 bullet points that you'll see at the bottom of page 97 running over to the top of page 98. And what those 3 bullet points do is they draw out, insofar as there are any site-specific matters that need to be addressed, those matters. So they are, in essence, the only additional points. We don't consider that they need or justify site-specific policies, but they do need specific mention, and we've done that there. I can take them quite quickly. The first one was actually in already. We've simply moved it around for the purpose of clarity, and that deals with open space. So you'll see in the table the annotation of 2 asterisks. That's to show that we've identified an open space on those sites, and that should be, where appropriate, retained or re-provided. The second bullet point deals with the SAC, and in its essence is making clear that the requirements of the GI policies which deal with the SAC will need to be addressed on those sites because of their relationship and proximity to the SAC. And then thirdly, H39, this is about the western boundary. We can come on to that in Greenbelt terms, but in essence we are making express the need to address the western boundary there. Continuing down into the table, we'll obviously come on to these sites in due course, but in essence what we've done is to remove what was not necessary. So the estimated phasing wasn't necessary because you have an updated trajectory, which we've already been over in quite some detail. And we've corrected and, where appropriate, amended some of the numbers in the table itself. We can touch on those in due course, but that's essentially what has happened there. And then turning to the bottom of the table, the explanation has been modified slightly. The purposes of that modification, Ms Bartle can come on to this, but in short, it is to make clear that these are indicative capacities. They are not targets, nor are they caps. So to leave flexibility both up and down as appropriate. And then below that, there is a whole series of texts which you may look at and say, well, why is that crossed through? Unfortunately, on the printing, the annotation didn't come with it. That text is all being retained. But our view is that's all best grouped together with the other strategic housing text that we have, because in essence it deals with overarching spatial and strategic matters. It's not really dealing with small sites. So all of that's retained. It's simply going to be moved into a more appropriate location. So it looks like a large change, but in essence it's one of form, not substance, on the supporting text. Ms Bartle, do you want to come in on that?
I think you've covered everything in that respect. I think we'll deal with the specifics as we go through the sites, if that's okay.
Mr Henderson, could I ask a question, please? Hello.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you.
Sorry, is this okay? Could you just...
On this occasion, yeah.
Sorry. You've crossed out estimating phasing,
yeah.
And you said just now that this has been covered. Yes. I wasn't here yesterday.
It wasn't yesterday.
Okay. So what are you replacing with this estimating phasing? What's happening?
Yeah, it's all been dealt with by the updated trajectory. Ms Bartle can recap that. It was dealt with earlier, but I think we can summarise it for you today.
If it helps, if I give you my understanding, is that the plan as submitted included a sort of phasing clause, if you like, in policy H1, which in effect held sites back until certain phases. The council is proposing that it shouldn't any longer do that, and so that they are proposing to remove reference to phasing from policy H1 and also to remove the estimated phasing column from table 5.1. In terms of when sites are likely to come forward, or when the plan anticipates that sites will come forward, the council says that that is set out in the updated housing trajectory that's included in the plan. Is that about right?
Yes, that's correct, sir. And the objective of flexibility and not constraining growth unnecessarily.
Mr. Willis.
Chair, could I ask a question on a point of process? So my friend here intervened and you said on this occasion you would allow her to speak. What is the process here today? When do we get an opportunity to speak? Will you ask us to? Should we stick our hands up? What's the form?
Yeah, my apologies. That's my fault because I didn't do my sort of more formal opening that I would normally do. So, yeah, the form really is, my colleague Mr. Griffiths and I will sort of lead the discussion, and then as we go along, if you want to come into the debate and contribute, I don't know why this is the thing, but the tradition these days is to append your nameplate. If you sort of stand it like that, in effect, and I'll bring you in as soon as I sort of see you, and it seems about right at the right point in the conversation. Is there anything else on the sort of procedure for the day that you might have questions about?
So we'd like really to understand how the day is likely to pan out, because we're a little mystified as to the likely order of topics and when specific sites will be brought in. Will they be brought into each of the MIQs, or how will it work?
Yeah, I was just going to come on to that, actually. So thank you for reminding me and prompting me, Mr. Tozer. Yeah, so what I'm going to do, first of all, is take issues. So basically, I haven't set out any separate agenda. And I'm simply using the matters, issues and questions to form the basis for our discussion today, which is what we've done on other days. And I like to try and keep things as simple as possible rather than burdening people with more papers and stuff like that. So what I'm going to do today is take, first of all, issues 8.1 and 8.2 together because, well, they're a natural pair, if you like. Then in terms of the actual sites, I'm going to consider each site in turn against issues 8.3, 4 and 5, and simply go through the sites as they are set out in table 5.1. So I'll start with H1, H3, H5 and so on. So that's how I'm intending to run the day. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And presumably, if we have any point to raise at the end of that, we're free to do so at your discretion. Or do we just get one bite of the cherry and then timed out, or how does it work?
No, not necessarily one bite of the cherry. What I don't want, though, and I certainly don't need, is to hear any repetition. So if you want to make a point to me, Mr. Tozer, that's fine. We then have that point. I don't need anybody else to say the same thing, because it is therefore something that we will take into account. Is there anything else then before I move on? Councillor Waters.
Thank you, sir. You won't consider it rude or be offended if, when we've spoken on the particular site that we're interested in, we just quietly leave?
I'm not easily offended, Councillor Waters, and anyone is free to leave once they've made the contributions that they want. Okay then. I would say both my colleague and I do struggle a little to see the nameplates that are further away. So if you could sort of help us out by perhaps Well, in fact, I know Mr. Merritt, Councillor Waters. I'm struggling with you, Councillor Dykes. Okay, thank you. In which case then I'll turn to issues 8.1 and 8.2. So, yeah, quite often in local plans like this, you will find a specific policy for all of the sites allocated, and most particularly perhaps housing sites. That's not the form or the way that this plan deals with that. And our question, our overriding question there really is, well, why not? Do you need site-specific policies? And we have touched on this before, so I know what you're going to say, but for the benefit of all.
There's one for Ms Bartle.
Yes, in terms of recapping those points that we made earlier, it's certainly our view that it would be unnecessary in this case to include additional policy related specifically to the smaller allocated sites. We have, of course, got policy related to the strategic sites, but we make we deliberately distinguish between the two types of sites. And in the case of small sites that are allocated, we are content that the policies within the rest of the plan deal sufficiently with matters that would be or form part of an application and be used to assess those schemes that come forward. Ms Henderson's outlined earlier this morning the additional modifications that we've proposed to policy H1 that do deal with those few points that are site-specific related, and we are of the view that those modifications deal sufficiently with the matters that are pertinent to those policies, and remaining matters can be dealt with through the rest of the plan policies. Oh, yes. So in terms of the operation of the policy and how it would be applied to an application, the approach that we anticipate is that the policy H1 in effect gives the effect of the allocation, and then the decision maker would principally then turn to DP3 in the plan, which then provides the next layer of guiding principles effectively to work through that assessment process. And then stemming from that, you would have more topic specific policies depending on the nature of the site and the characteristics of the scheme. So it's a layered approach, you could describe it as.
So in short then, is it because the sites that we're talking about under policy H1 don't include specific requirements, for example, a grade separated junction that you might see on some of the larger sites, or any of those sorts of requirements? And I think you say that to have site-specific policies for these sites would simply be repetitive of the requirements set out in the plan anyway.
Correct, sir, yes. And yes, the sites, all of those sites are not, don't fall into the considerations of infrastructure requirements, particularly and notably that the strategic sites do and have formed part and parcel of the considerations and require, in that context, specific policy provisions to guide and direct those proposals.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. Is anyone here to tell us that that's not the right way to do things? Councillor Waters.
Well, certainly with regard to site H31, it could reasonably be said that a site-specific policy might have resulted in some sensible infrastructure to actually access that site. I've actually come this morning with a sense of disappointment, really, that I've so little to actually contribute about this site allocation that's in my ward, that's in this local plan, which might actually be a cause for celebration because you might get finished a bit earlier. But it was awful in here yesterday. But it's impossible to actually make appropriate representation about a site allocation that's already been granted recent planning approval by the council in advance of this local plan process. Now, this will get more relevant to infrastructure as I go on, but I sat on that planning committee that dealt with the application, and I've heard from the parish council and residents following that decision. I tried at committee, given the advanced stage of the local plan inquiry process, the hearings at the time were thought to be imminent, to have the application deferred until the H31 site specific matter went through this inquiry.
If sorry, Councillor Waters, if I can just ask, is the point that you're developing there specifically about H31?
Yeah.
If so, it's an admirable attempt to get to talk about that site before the others in the list.
Right.
But if it's just about H31, if I can ask you to hold fire for the moment.
Yeah, that's fine. It was just a good point in relation to why it was important to have site-specific policies, if not for all these small sites, certainly for some of them that were constrained with sensible infrastructure, as H31 is.
Yeah, I understand the point you're making, yeah. Anyone else on issues 8.1 and 8.2? I know everyone's very keen to talk about the sites that they've come to speak about, Mrs. Kinder.
Thank you. Yes, if we're talking about, you just said, subject of site policy on all the H's, the one thing I'd like to raise is in the documentation, there doesn't seem to be, from 2019 to 2021, the documents that I'm referring to, an understanding of the York City Council's use of the word urban. There is an urban-rural definition developed by DEFRA, which is used for government policy. It's a tool to inform policy decision. And they have in their documents, when they're defining, they've defined Elvington as rural in the GB Addendum 2021, but they've also defined 3 small industrial units in Elvington as urban, and they have drawn a line on a map at the side of H39 and said that that is the urban part of the village, but that is actually up against 5 or 6 residential houses, so that's a contradiction. It's not clear what defines urban in the York City Council documents, and in the Green Belt documents, when they're talking about green wedges, an extension out from the city, from the ring road, they have a map of the whole of the city and all the villages with the green wedges they call out to the villages. And Elvington is missed out completely, but we have 6 miles of farmland either side of the B1228. From the A64 is 6 miles of farmland either side that single road that comes down to Elvington. And so I don't understand why we haven't got our green wedges. And in the urban-rural definition, or the government definition, Elvington is defined as a rural village and dispersed. So I'm sorry, that is about all of the H numbers. As the gentleman previously just mentioned, it's the whole of 8.1. I'm addressing this, any site-specific policy. I don't see that we have applied a policy to the understanding of what is urban and rural. The definition is population density of 10,000 people or more and access to services. Thank you.
So just to be sure that I have that clear in my mind, Mrs. Kinder, I think ultimately you're suggesting that policy H1 should include something that sets out, that defines urban and rural. Is that right?
Yes, I would apply it to all the H's in 8.1, in the point 8.1, because you're talking about this whole set of tiny parcels allocated, not made subject on a site-specific policy. So although I've given you an example of H39, which obviously is in my village, there are other villages which will be in the same situation. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for that. Mr. Henderson?
Well, so I think the short answer on that is those terms aren't used in policy H1, so policy H1 doesn't need those terms to be defined. If and insofar as the complaint is about the process of assessment, that matters to be considered site by site. We've heard some site-specific examples that I'm sure we can come on to later. But in terms of your questions and the operation of policy H1, those definitions aren't required for that policy to work effectively or to be found sound.
Okay, thank you. Anything else on that issue or issues 8.1 and 8.2? Good. I'll move then on to issues 8.3, 4 and 5, and as I explained earlier, I will do this basically site by site. And if I can ask the Council, as we go along, to do two things. The first is to let us know, as I've already started to hear, anything about planning permissions that have been granted, but also, as we go along, where there is a main modification in relation to the site that we're looking at, if you could explain that to us, explain the reason for the proposed main modification to us. So let us go directly then to site H1. And we do have some proposed main modifications in relation to that site, I note.
Yes, we do, sir. So H1 is one of our brownfield urban sites, and as it was expressed in the submitted version of policy H1, the site was separated or split up into phases. Given that there is now an outline consent on the site and subsequent reserve matters, the approach seemed...
I'm sorry, what did you say about reserve matters?
Okay, I was going to come back to that, but I'll deal with the policy. Well, if I can just explain the rationale for grouping it together, and then I'll detail the planning status. So, as originally proposed, it was in two phases, one site but separated out. As a result of the outline that was subsequently approved post submission of the plan, and on reflection, it's now more sensible to just simply refer to it in one single row, and therefore the site area reflects the two areas, and the phasings are drawn together. The update and increase in estimated yield relates to that outline consent. So that was granted in 2020 for a maximum of 607 properties, with all matters reserved. There have since been reserve matters approval on what's referred to as Zone A and Zone C in 2021. Just to be clear on the references, these are all made clear in the Council's submission to support the 5-year land supply. So that's the EXCYC 76A. obviously that was a date of April 2022, so I will refer to any updates since then as well. So there's a remaining reserve matters on the site, which is currently pending. That was only validated a few months, or June, sorry, of this year. So that's the approach to site H1.
Out of interest, Ms. Bartle, how did it jump from 330 to 607? Was it denser, or was it a different character
Higher,
development?
yes, higher rise. So the original calculations were done on a typology-based approach. So just took a multiplication of the density by site area. So and that's one of the reasons why you'll see in the explanatory text we've just made clear that the figures identified in this table are not to be seen as policy targets. For those reasons, we accept that there's fluidity and flexibility that needs to be built in.
I'm assuming, Ms. Bartle, that either the reserve matters, the outline or one of the reserve matters consents does produce the 607, given we do have a specific number coming out of what's been permitted.
Yes, sorry, if I didn't make that clear, apologies. The outline is for up to 607. Hence the very specific figure in the table.
Yes, okay, thank you. Is anyone here to talk about site H1? Okay, very good. Well, I think that unless... Yeah, I don't have any further questions on that, so I think we can take everything else as read, which means that we can then move on to site H3.
Yes, site H3 is one of the council's own housing delivery programme sites. It does have the benefit of outline planning permission, which was granted at the end of 2021, and that's for 83 homes, and that correlates with the modification that's proposed.
My apologies, I just didn't catch what you said. Do forgive me. I think you said that it has permission for 83. Was that an outline? Or?
It's outline, correct, yes. And that was granted, sir, at the in October 2021, so relatively recently. And that's the reason for the increase in the capacity, as shown.
And reserve matters?
No application for reserve matters has been submitted as yet, but as I say, it's part of the council's housing delivery programme, so it is being worked on and expected to be submitted in due course.
Yeah, so what is the council's housing delivery programme? What do you mean by that?
So that's the council's the council's own sites where land has been identified for release and promoted for housing. A number of the sites are advancing successfully, and I'm just trying to check. I think on this one potentially a developer has been procurement process has been agreed on this site, but I can't find mine. But in essence, yes, they are council's disposal of land that are being put forward.
It's not a council development. The council disposes of the site to another developer who gets outline planning permission reserve matters.
Correct. The council isn't acting as a developer in any way. It's going through the very conventional process of working with developers.
So it's straightforward market housing?
It is. Some of them do have a higher proportion of affordable housing in them, and when we provide you with the indication of the affordable housing in relation to the trajectory, it will be made clear. I can't tell you at the moment offhand, I don't have those figures in front of me, but some of them do have a slightly higher proportion of affordable housing.
But for the purpose of considering its planning status, if it's a council site that has permission, it will have been to the market, there will be a developer on board. It's not like those circumstances where the council gets the permission and then tries to sell the site with the benefit of that. So it's slightly different to that. But of course, footnote 11, we've got an outline permission, it's not expired, no clear evidence, we're home on deliverability there.
Is there anyone else here to talk about site H3? Okay, thank you. I'll move then. I'll take, as I say, anything else on that as read and move on to site H5.
Yes, another of the council's housing delivery sites. And in this case, development is actually well underway on the site with a number of properties complete. So that's as of April 2022, which is our base date for these figures, 72 were complete, which gives a residual number of 93 that we're estimating on that site.
Okay, so that has permission, which has been implemented, and development is currently occurring.
Correct, yes.
And the yield that you see is a net yield from the base date.
Okay, and the yield of 93 presumably is based on what has been given planning permission?
Correct, yes.
Just out of interest, that one went down from 162 to 93?
Yes, it did. You're going to ask me why. And off the top of my head, I can certainly find that out for you. And
I'm only asking out of interest. It doesn't go to anything.
Oh no, it's actually, sorry, it's because it's a residual amount. Sorry, I just twigged him.
So if you add the 72
yes.
and the 93 together, so you get 165, which is pretty much the same place.
So the 93 figure takes account of the 72 completions that have already taken.
Correct, yes.
Brilliant.
Sorry, I was...
Yeah, I'm being a bit
making it more
slow with
complicated
that
in my head.
Sorry. Brilliant, thank you.
And so that's why I said it was a net yield from the base date. That's probably a more complicated way of explaining it than I necessarily needed to. But what we're trying to show there is the supply that is anticipated from that base date, because of course those 72 will go into our completions column rather than our supply column.
Yeah, we're just wondering why table 5.1 would show that rather than the overall yield from each site. It's sort of slightly confusing. Well, it is to us anyway.
I suppose that there's an argument, I've seen it applied in other local plans where sites that are as advanced as that aren't actually allocated because they are so far advanced. So there's perhaps an argument there that, or a question whether it should be there. But if it is in the policy, then I'd accept the point that perhaps it should actually reflect the overall capacity of the site. I think what there was an attempt to do was tie up the figures with the figures in the supply and trajectory calculations, but clearly it's not necessary if that evidence is provided elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a very small point. But what I wouldn't want is for the figures that are in that column in table 5.1 to leave Mr. Griffiths and I scratching our heads when we come to writing our report and trying to make the figures add up and wondering why they don't. So, I personally think it's going to be more helpful for the plan to certainly show the overall yield anticipated from each of the proposed allocated sites. It may well be helpful to have the column in as you have it at present. But yeah, I mean, frankly, if you could do that, please.
I guess the thinking that through, that perhaps taking a point on the numbers adding up and with what we say our overall supply is, obviously some of those figures will be captured in our completions already. So there's an element of some double counting, potentially, not significant numbers. But if you're content that that's not significant.
I think as long as the table is clear about what that number is, so if it's estimated yield, I think that's fine, because you're talking about the totality of what that site will bring forward, and I think that's clear. That's clear. When it comes to doing a trajectory, you will have to account for ones that have already been completed. So the complication is there, but I think if the table just shows yield, it keeps it straightforward. I think. Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. We'll make that change. We'll put a footnote in that explains the position. H5, I think it is now. But we've pretty much covered everything that we have to say on H5, unless there's anything arising.
Yes, given that development is underway, I certainly don't have any further questions. Mr. Willis.
Could I just ask for a general point of clarification on this table and whether it's the intention at some point to replace the estimated phasings with new phasings, or is everything just at some point in the future?
There will not be new phasing, no.
Okay, thank you. I'll move then on to site H6.
Yes, and I need to apologise for some confusion here. We've shown it in the latest version of modifications as being deleted on the basis that we assumed that it had been complete and developed out. Development is underway, but the completions actually haven't come through our completion monitoring process at the moment. Therefore, it should remain in the table, and rather than a 0 being applied, which was a reference to the site being earmarked for communal establishments, in this case an extra care scheme, we're proposing to include a capacity of 28, which is in effect the ratio applied to the number of bed spaces, in accordance with the approach that the council is taking generally to the calculation of communal establishments and student housing separately. So we would correct that deletion, and as I say, just substitute the 0 with a 28 to reflect the permission and the development that's on the site.
Okay, just for my clarity, what is the planning permission for? What is being built there currently?
It is an extra care scheme of, just bear with me one. Apologies, I don't have the pro forma because we didn't submit it as part of the trajectory, because it was, just bear with me, I might have it. Oh yeah, I've got it here. Sorry, I have the planning reference. Oh, here we go. It's approval for 30 apartments of 51 bed spaces.
Sorry, 30 apartments and?
Providing 51 bed spaces and some ancillary B1 use. And sorry, that has been submitted as a pro forma under the communal establishments in the trajectory.
Okay, and you say you're not, despite the draft table 5.1, you're not proposing that that should be deleted?
Correct, yes. Apologies again for incorrectly suggesting we were.
Okay, I don't have anything else on that, and it appears that nobody else does either. So I'll move then to site H7. I think we're having the slightly artificial sense of making really good progress.
Okay, so H7 is has full planning permission for 93 dwellings on the site, which was approved in February of this year, and the capacity and the yield, estimated yield in the table has been increased to correlate with that approval. It's a Persimmon Home site, and initial site preparation and demolition works are currently ongoing.
So that planning permission has in effect been implemented?
Correct, yes.
Anyone here to talk about site H7? Okay, H8 then.
H8, yes, is another of the council's sites, apologies, and it doesn't have any planning status on the site. It does have a current use, it's currently in use as a temporary use as a vaccination centre, but we provided evidence through the work to support the 5-year land supply of the council's commitment to the site, and a qualification of a member's resolution to continue to progress that site. So it was proposed to be deliverable within the later phases of the 5-year supply. Yes, in years 4 and 5. Apologies, not 4 and 5, 5 and 6.
Okay, and this site, as I understand it, involves the delineation of a green belt boundary. Perhaps you could
Correct.
Tell me about that.
Yes, just bear with me a moment while I just find the other document. Yes, so it's just one of the site boundaries, and well, just in general terms, you'll have seen from the matter statement we've provided an outline of the approach to the boundaries, and indeed you've already heard the council's explanation of the methodology. So as it relates to this particular site, it is that western boundary which is it follows the line of the railway, the East Coast Main Line. So on that basis is clearly recognisable and permanent. And we say, therefore, it's a sound boundary.
And so CYC 59E gives you the assessment showing you the boundary and then the assessment against the purposes. So it's certainly 3 of the Greenbelt purposes are all dealt with there. Preserving the setting and special character, historic towns, keeping it permanently open to prevent unrestricted sprawl, and safeguarding the countryside from encroachment. So it's CYC 59E, PDF page 268. I don't ask you to turn it up, but if you need to consider why, that's where you look.
On the face of it, it appears to me that this is one of the more straightforward sections of Greenbelt boundary, and that it's simply following the railway line at this point, and H8 is to the east of that, within what may or may not already be a built-up area. We have yet, as you know, to go out and look at the Greenbelt boundaries proposed, but we will be doing that in due course.
So that's correct, yeah.
Do I need to know what's going to happen to the vaccination centre?
It will be closed at some point, possibly going to be told when. Thank you. I'm informed that it's on a short-term lease and will expire this year. As I say, we provided evidence of the members' resolution to advance the proposals on that site as part of the submission to support the trajectory.
Okay, is anyone else here to talk about H8? Okay, thank you for that. H10 then.
Yes, H10 is another of our brownfield sites. We're not actually proposing to change the yield as submitted on this site. It does that yield relates to an extant and implemented permission that was granted back in 2017 that included a relatively high density development of apartments. Since then, the permission has not continued to be, or development has not continued, but there are a number of pre-application inquiries underway to support alternative schemes for the site, and it's a Persimmon Homes owned site.
So we say it has permission, implemented, not expired, deliverable. No clear evidence to the contrary. Yes, the development's paused, but we've got it in the hands of a developer, Persimmon. We've taken a realistic approach, and there is evidence of it progressing with those 3 pre-applications.
Yes, indeed, and on that basis, we deliberately forecast it to be built in the later stages, or in year 6, if we assume we're currently in year 1 of our trajectory.
Why has the development granted in 2017 stalled?
I think my understanding is that the quantum of, it was a solely apartment scheme, that the alternative uses are being considered, including more mixed, so with hotel, some student accommodation, and other options are being looked at. We don't believe it's an issue of viability. I think it's simply that more viable options are being considered.
Councillor Waters.
Thank you, sir. You're very correct to question the unimplemented permission. You might also care to ask the council how long this site has remained undeveloped, derelict, because from my recollection it's 15 years.
Well, so it's not unimplemented. We've explained it has been implemented. The permission has been protected. We're not putting this in the first 5 years in terms of deliverability. You just need to be satisfied that it is developable. Clearly, we crossed that threshold in the consent. It's in the hands of the developer, and we've got the pre-applications to come forward. No contrary evidence on viability or any other matters to suggest that it's constrained site clearly meets the definition.
And so for the avoidance of any doubt, because the planning permission has been implemented, irrespective of the scale of that, it has been implemented, and therefore the development that has been granted planning permission could come forward at any time without the need for any further permissions.
Correct, yes, yes.
And that's, Mr. Henderson, I think what you mean by when you say that the planning permission has been protected.
Precisely so, sir, yeah.
The site's owned by Persimmon Homes too, just to make that clear. So it is in the hands of a developer.
Anything else on that, Councillor Waters?
Well, only to add that it's been in the hands of Persimmons for, as I say, at least 15 years. Now, whether there's some future discussions on viability and such like between the developer and the council to actually get it moving, I'm not privy to.
I think the allocation would be beneficial to it in advancing it. I don't see why that would, that the allocation as we're discussing here would in any way prejudice it from coming forward.
Is there a need to look again at the 187 figure in the light of what you've told us about whether an alternative proposal or some other scheme that may include a hotel and or student housing, that sort of thing? But I asked that question, but then you would ask me what should we change it to, because you obviously won't know. But I'm just sort of raising the possibility.
Yeah, it's an entirely reasonable point. And I think our position is that we don't have any other evidence of a scheme on the site. We know the site is capable of delivering that, and we make clear that that is not a policy target for that site. If a scheme came forward with less than and it was otherwise acceptable, we wouldn't withhold planning permission.
I'm happy with that. Thank you.
Anything else on site H10? Councillor Waters.
Only just to say this is probably another good argument for a site-specific policy. It's a major brownfield site on a very prominent location that's got a long history in York, and it probably would have benefited from a site-specific policy to actually get it moving.
So I'm afraid we're not quite clear what the councillor's ask is. What's the modification that he wants to see? He says a site-specific policy, okay, so what's that going to contain? What is it about this site that he feels needs to be addressed in a site-specific policy? We've not heard anything about that. No reps in writing to explain what modification he wants, nothing suggested today. So we maintain the position we've outlined. This site is allocated, the principle is confirmed, the principle of the use is confirmed by this policy. There's no other evidence before you or indeed us to suggest anything further needs to be addressed. No modification is required.
Is your concern, Councillor Waters, that the site won't come forward?
As you know, I'd only attended to speak to H31, but I just took advantage of the fact that I'm here, and I just find it, again, I won't say the word disingenuous, but to actually promote this as a minor delay since 2017, when this site has been derelict, as I say, for 15 years, there is something wrong in how this has been progressed between the council and Persimmons, who have had that site all this time. That's what I'm trying to get across, is the actual deliverability of this site, and how it would have been better if the aspirations for both parties had been set out in a site-specific policy, which might have moved it forward.
A final point on this site from the council, if you have any to make.
Well, so insofar as the council needs to express an ambition for it, it does so through policy H1. Principle of the use is acceptable with an indicative yield. No evidence that anything more is required, and to be clear, we're putting this in year 6, so it's developable, not deliverable.
So that's to say, notwithstanding the existence of an implemented planning permission, the council doesn't anticipate this site coming forward in the first 5 years.
That's correct, sir, yes. We've looked at those characteristics that you've been told about today. We've looked at the pre-app, and that's our judgment in the circumstances. Footnote 12, reasonable prospect the site is available, could be viably developed at the point envisaged. Clearly meets that criteria in our submission.
Okay, thank you. I understand all of that. Unless there's anything else, I'll move to site H20.
Yes, site 20 says we are proposing a modification to the yield in this case, which relates to an application which is currently pending with the council for a 64-bed care home. So the proposal to identify a yield, estimated yield of 36 is again the application of that ratio to generate that figure. The application was submitted earlier this year, and there are no significant constraints to this particular site.
Okay, and we don't have any further questions on that. Is anyone here to talk about H20? Okay, thank you. I'll go then to H22.
H22 has been developed in its entirety, hence the deletion proposed. And in fact, the same applies to H23 underneath as well. Also developed out in full.
Just going back to our earlier conversation about that, we draw the line between those that have something left to deliver and those which are entirely built out.
I suppose the potential difficulty with that is that as we're examining the plan, those developments will be continuing. It's just a question of whether they're developed out before the examination finishes.
It would, sir, save that we've essentially frozen our evidence on a 1st of April 2022 base date. We did that for the purpose of supply, and we propose to do that for this too.
That's helpful, thank you.
Yes, given that they're both built, I have no questions whatsoever about sites H22 and 23, and I don't think anyone's here to talk about those. Before I move on to H29, I don't know about anyone else, but I'm feeling rather warm, so I'm going to take a bit of a break, a bit earlier than I ordinarily would, but nonetheless, I make it 10:36. I adjourn the hearing to resume at 10:55. Thank you.
Can I